My daughter-in-law slapped me. But when she saw the 70-mother mansion still in my name, she called me 39 times. I still remember the sting on my cheek that winter afternoon, the sound of my own breath shaking as my daughter-in-law walked away without a word. Hours later, she stood in my living room again, smiling as if nothing had happened, and talking about how a woman my age shouldn't have to manage such a big house. What she didn't know was that the $17 million mansion she had her eyes on had never left my name. When she finally found out, she called me 39 times in one night. I used to believe silence kept a family together, but that night I learned silence can be a weapon too. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Subscribe if you understand what it feels like to be treated as a burden, even after carrying the family on your back. The mornings in Newport have a way of creeping into your bones. That fine mist that rolls in from the Atlantic seems to settle on the skin and stay there, carrying with it the faint tang of salt and the memory of every storm that has ever brushed this coastline. I woke early, as I always do, to the sound of gulls quarreling over scraps down by the docks. My knees protested as I swung my legs out of bed, but I have learned to greet each ache like an old acquaintance. At 74, I count it as a blessing that I can still move through my own home without help. The house sits on a rise just beyond the seawall, a colonial revival with tall white columns and windows that drink in the morning light. I have lived here for nearly 40 years. Every room carries the shape of my life. The kitchen still smells faintly of rosemary and lemon from yesterday's roast chicken. The library holds the scent of old oak and dust, the kind of dust you stop trying to chase because it belongs as much as the books do. Out back, the rose garden is waking slowly, buds tight against the early chill. That morning, I moved through my usual routine. Coffee first, strong enough to stand a spoon in. I drank it at the kitchen island while checking the day's grocery list. I planned to stop by the farmer's market later for fresh clams and some of those sweet little carrots I like. The market has been my Saturday ritual since before my husband passed. It is one of those habits that keeps me tethered to a sense of continuity, even as so much else shifts beneath my feet. I had just finished wiping down the counter when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. A glance through the front window showed Brian's black SUV turning in, Sloan in the passenger seat. The two of them rarely come without calling first, so I knew there was a reason for this visit. I smoothed my sweater, more out of habit than vanity, and opened the front door before they reached the steps. Brian hugged me lightly, the way a man does when he is thinking about other things. Sloan's smile was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. She carried a large tote bag over one shoulder, the kind meant to suggest casualness, though I doubted anything she did was without calculation. We settled in the living room, the three of us arranged like polite strangers at a doctor's waiting room. Brian asked how I was feeling, the kind of question that sounds warm but carries no real heat. I told him I was fine, busy with the garden and my reading group. Sloan tilted her head, glancing around the room as if taking stock of what might need updating. It did not take long for her to steer the conversation to the house. She spoke about upkeep, about how hard it must be for me to manage such a big property alone. Her voice was soft, each word wrapped in concern, but I could hear the faint metallic ring beneath it. I told her I had no trouble keeping up. I did not tell her about the mornings my hands stiffened so badly I could barely turn the doorknob, or the evenings when the silence pressed against the walls like a tide coming in. Some truths are best kept for yourself. The air shifted when she mentioned the idea of downsizing. It was not the first time she had raised it, but there was a different edge to it now. She spoke of efficiency, of freeing me from burdens, of opportunities for them to help me transition into something smaller and easier. Her tone was smooth, but there was a current underneath, One I had learned to read after years of marriage, years of business negotiations, years of watching people dress greed as generosity. I listened, nodding when it seemed polite, sipping my coffee to fill the spaces between her sentences. Brian avoided my eyes, studying a spot on the rug. I wondered if he realized that his silence spoke louder than anything Sloane was saying. When they finally stood to leave, Sloane gave me that same practiced smile, the one that said we were all on the same team. I walked them to the door, watching as the SUV backed down the drive. I stayed there a moment longer, feeling the damp breeze off the ocean. The roses along the side path trembled in the wind, not yet in bloom but holding the promise of it. Back inside, I cleared the coffee cups and placed them in the dishwasher. The room felt larger somehow, the air thinner. I thought about the way Sloane's gaze had lingered on the view from the living room window, the same view that had made me fall in love with this house the first day I saw it. I thought about how easily she spoke of changing what had been my anchor for decades. I went to the library and stood by the window there, looking out toward the water. A fishing boat was making its way back to harbor, the gulls already circling above it. Life on the water follows its own rhythm, tides and returns, comings and goings. I have always believed that a home should have a similar rhythm, but I could feel a shift in the current now, slow but steady, a pull towards something I had not invited. That night, as I settled into bed, I could still hear the crunch of tires on gravel, see the way Brian kept his eyes on the floor, and feel the weight of Sloane's smile. The house creaked softly around me, an old companion adjusting to the night. I closed my eyes and told myself that tomorrow I would go to the market, pick out the clams, and talk about nothing heavier than the weather. But somewhere in the quiet space before sleep, I knew the conversation we had that morning was not over. It had only just begun. The invitation came 2 days later. Brian called in the morning, his voice flat, saying they thought it would be nice to have dinner together at the wharf house down by the pier. It was not a place we usually went as a family. The wharf house is more of a place for tourists or couples celebrating anniversaries. All candlelight and polished wood, the smell of grilled seafood carrying over from the open kitchen. I said yes without hesitation. Sometimes it is better to step into a situation than let it come to you. The evening was cool, the kind where the air smells faintly of salt and diesel from the boats moored along the dock. I dressed in a navy sweater and slacks, sensible shoes for the uneven planks of the pier. The restaurant was busy, the murmur of conversation blending with the clink of silverware. Brian waved from a corner table by the window, where the last of the sunlight spread a soft gold across the water. Sloane was already seated, a glass of white wine in hand. We ordered quickly. I chose the grilled swordfish, something I have eaten here for years, though never with them. Sloane chatted easily at first, telling stories about a client's vacation in Italy, laughing in a way that showed she had been practicing. Brian nodded along, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in weeks. It was almost comfortable until the conversation shifted. It started with a comment about the storm last winter and the shingles that came loose from the roof. Sloane asked if I had ever considered replacing the roof entirely, perhaps even selling before the next big storm did more damage. She spoke as though she were talking about the weather, her tone light, but I could hear the intention under it. I said the roof was fine, repairs had been made, and the house was holding steady. Her smile thinned. She leaned forward, her hands folded on the table as if confiding in me. She talked about how hard it is for older people to manage large homes, how much stress it can bring, how freeing it can feel to let go of something so demanding. She glanced at Brian as if expecting him to join in, but he kept his eyes on his drink. I listened. I have learned that silence can feel heavier than any argument, and sometimes people will rush to fill that silence with more than they intended to reveal. Sloane went on, speaking about market values, how properties like mine were at their peak, how a smart move now could mean a comfortable future without worry. She spoke as if I had not built that future already, as if my years of work and careful planning needed her blessing to be complete. The waitress brought our meals, breaking the thread of her pitch. We ate in near silence for a while. The swordfish was perfectly cooked, flaky and tender, but it tasted muted against the current of the conversation. Out the window, the tide had turned, pulling the water away from the shore in slow, steady streams. When the plates were cleared, Sloane steered us back toward her topic. She said she had been talking to a friend in real estate who thought the property could fetch a record price. She mentioned the idea of a smaller home, something in town, close to shops and the library. Her voice softened when she spoke of convenience, of safety, of neighbors nearby. I smiled and told her I liked my view of the water and my roses, and that seemed to end it, at least for the moment. As we stood outside waiting for Brian to settle the check, Sloane walked beside me on the pier. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp scent of the sea. She leaned in slightly and said in a voice meant only for me that a big old house can be dangerous for someone my age. Her tone was still smooth, but there was an edge to it now, something colder. She mentioned that accidents happen all the time, a slip on the stairs, a fall in the garden, and that sometimes no one is there to help. I looked out toward the darkening horizon, letting her words pass without answer. The gulls were gathering again, their cries carrying over the water, sharp and insistent. I could feel her watching me, waiting for a reaction, but I gave her none. Brian came up behind us then, jangling his keys, and the moment passed. The ride home was quiet. I sat in the back seat, watching the streetlights flicker over the hood of the car. Sloane talked to Brian about a new project she was working on, her voice bright again, but I heard the echo of her earlier words in every sentence. When they dropped me off, I walked up the path alone. The roses along the side were just beginning to open, their petals pale in the moonlight. I paused at the front door, letting the sound of the ocean steady me. Inside, the house felt solid, the walls holding their quiet like a promise. I knew the conversation at dinner had not been about storms or convenience or safety. It had been about control, about seeing how far she could press. I closed the door and locked it, the click of the bolt louder than usual in the stillness. Upstairs, I changed into my nightclothes and sat by the window for a long time, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the water. The air was cool against my face, and I breathed it in slowly. Whatever current she thought she was setting in motion, I could feel my own rhythm underneath it, steady and sure. And I knew, with the same certainty I know the tide will always return, that this was not the last I would hear of her plans. The afternoon slid in gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed low over the water until the horizon looked bruised. I had spent the morning pruning the roses and sorting mail at the kitchen table, routine work that keeps a house honest. Just after 3, I heard the car again on the gravel and felt that small tightening in my chest that had become familiar. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to the front hall. The doorbell chimed, bright and polite. I opened the door to find Brian on the step, shoulders set as if bracing for wind, and Sloane behind him with a new handbag and a look of composure that sat too neatly on her face. We moved to the living room because that is where families pretend to be their best selves. The surf sounded faint through the windows, a soft pulling and returning that usually steadies me. Today it sounded like a clock I could not slow. Sloane began with concern. She had been thinking about safety. She had read about break-ins along the coast. She worried about me alone in a big house. She said a locksmith could change the back door hardware in an hour, and she had already spoken to someone about a schedule. Her words were smooth, each one placed with care like dishes set out for company. I said the locks were fine. I said I preferred to keep my keys and my routines as they were. Her smile did not change, but something else did. She walked to the back of the room and looked out at the yard as if considering where to put a fence. She said there had been incidents with older homeowners. She said it was unwise to ignore risk. She said she and Brian were ready to take responsibility. Brian stood by the mantel, silent, studying the framed photo of his father in a navy blazer, a photo that sits there like a lighthouse in a fog. I felt the distance widen between the three of us, even though we were only a few steps apart. I told them again that I would not change the locks and that any decisions about the house would be mine. I spoke evenly because I have learned that volume rarely wins what dignity can. The room cooled by a degree. Sloane turned from the window and crossed the rug, her heels pressing little crescents into the wool. She began to talk about stairs and bathtubs and the stories she had read where a preventable fall turned into a tragedy. She used the word liability. She used the word transition. She used the word necessary. Each term landed with the flat weight of paperwork. I felt something old and hot rise in my throat. Not anger so much as refusal finally taking shape. I said no. I said it once. Then again. She moved closer. Her perfume was light and sharp, a citrus that made the back of my mouth taste metallic. She was smiling, but her eyes were fixed and bright. She lifted her hand as if to make a point. The gesture hung there an instant too long. Then her palm struck my cheek. The sound was small but clean, like a glove hitting a desk. The sting came fast, then a bloom of heat that spread to my ear and jaw. Time did a small trick. Everything slowed, then rushed back. The surf rose and fell outside. The clock on the far wall ticked with ferocious calm. My hands stayed at my sides. I did not step back. I did not speak. I stared at the pattern of the rug and noticed a single strand of thread that had come loose near the coffee table, thin and pale like a winter hair. Brian moved a fraction, then stopped. His voice arrived a moment later, thin with panic, and something else I did not want to name. He said I had upset her. He said I had pushed too hard. He said we could all take a breath. He did not look at my cheek. He looked at the floor as if the answer might be written there in the wood grain. Sloane lowered her hand and stepped away. She adjusted the strap of her bag. She said she regretted the moment. She said emotions were high because she cared. She suggested again the locksmith and said she could handle the bill. The calm returned to her voice like a trained bird landing on a wrist. My face throbbed, but the pain was already moving inward to a place I could not reach with fingertips. I told them the conversation was over for the day. I told them I wanted them to leave. We walked together to the front door. The air in the hall felt cooler, cleaner. Brian muttered something about calling tomorrow. Sloane said we would revisit the topic when everyone had rested. I opened the door and stood aside. The gravel answered their steps with a steady crunch. Then the car door closed. Then the engine turned, and the sound faded down the drive until the only thing left was the distant water and the thin ring still humming in my ear. In the powder room off the foyer, I stood in front of the mirror and pressed 2 fingers to my cheek. The skin was flushed a deep pink that would pass by morning. I ran cold water over a washcloth and held it there, counting to 30 the way a nurse once taught me. My reflection looked exactly like me, only more alert, as if a lens had been shifted and now the edges were too sharp. I thought of the words Sloane had used all week, the tidy language of care and efficiency, and how easily a hand could slip out from behind those words. I walked through the house and locked the doors. I checked the back door twice, then once more for the rhythm of it. In the kitchen, I opened the notebook I keep by the phone and wrote down the time and what had happened in clean, even lines. I have always kept records, numbers from the store, appointments, notes from meetings. Now I added this, a line for a hand and a room and a silence that followed. By evening, the sky had cleared to a thin blue. I took a slow lap around the garden, not because the roses needed me, but because the air did. I moved carefully down the steps and across the flagstones, breathing in the damp green of the lawn. A neighbor waved from the street and I lifted my hand in return. My cheek had cooled, but the memory of heat lingered like a ghost in the skin. I knew I would sleep lightly. I knew that what had been hinted at over dinners and careful phrases had crossed a threshold in my living room. Back inside, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table. The house held me the way an old coat holds a familiar scent. I listened to the kettle settle, and the refrigerator hum, and the faint click of the hallway clock. I thought about the next steps I would take, and how I would take them without hurry. There is a kind of work that requires noise, and another kind that calls for patience, for a pen, for a folder set aside in a drawer that no one else opens. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of the house under my feet. The tide was moving. The current was real. And I understood, with a steadiness that surprised me, that quiet would be my ally until it no longer served me. The days after the slap passed with a stillness that felt unnatural. The house seemed to hold its breath, each room too quiet, as if waiting for the next disturbance. I moved through my routines as usual, watering the roses in the morning, reading in the library after lunch, stopping by the market for fresh bread. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, I could feel the balance shifting, the ground beneath the surface tilting toward something I could not yet see. It started with small murmurs. At the church kitchen, where I volunteer on Thursdays, a woman I barely knew leaned over the counter while we chopped vegetables and asked if I was doing all right at home. She mentioned hearing that I had left the oven on all night last week. I smiled politely and said the soup needed more salt. In the pool at the senior center, two acquaintances from my water aerobics class exchanged a look before asking if I had found someone to help me with the garden. The words were framed as kindness, but the undercurrent was there. I have lived long enough to recognize a pattern when I see one. These things do not happen by accident. They start with a phrase in a conversation, something that can be passed along with a tilt of the head, a suggestion that someone is slipping, losing track. It is a quiet sort of sabotage, one that leaves no fingerprints but works its way into the minds of neighbors and friends until it becomes something they believe they saw for themselves. Back at the house, I began to notice other changes. The cabinet in my study, where I keep important documents, looks slightly out of line with the carpet pattern. The top drawer of the desk in the library, the one that sticks a little, had been pulled all the way out and pushed back in without the usual scuff mark it leaves when I close it. These were not accidents. Someone had been inside those drawers looking for something they thought I would not notice was gone. I did not call Brian. I did not confront Sloan. I have learned that to react too soon is to tip your hand. Instead, I took a slow walk down the gravel drive to the mailbox and then kept walking along the road until I reached May's house. She was in her yard, trimming back the lavender bushes, her wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. She saw me coming and set the shears aside, her eyes narrowing just enough for me to know she had been expecting a visit. We sat on her porch with iced tea, speaking of small things until I told her about the oven story, about the questions at the pool, about the drawers. May has a way of listening without blinking, as if she is catching every word in a net. When I was done, she nodded once and said she would keep her ears open. In a town like ours, information travels faster than the tide, and May knew exactly which currents to watch. That night, I walked the house after dark, checking locks, looking for signs that someone had been inside again. The back door latch felt loose, though it had been fine the day before. I tightened the screws myself and made a note in my kitchen notebook. I began carrying that notebook from room to room, jotting down anything out of place, no matter how small. The following afternoon, I called Leighton's office. I told his assistant I wanted to review the status of my estate documents, especially the deed to the house. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that tells you someone is suddenly paying closer attention. She said he could see me the next morning. I hung up and felt the first real sense of steadiness I had had all week. As the sun went down, I sat in the library, the long light of evening stretching across the rug, and thought about how quickly a story can be rewritten if you let someone else hold the pen. I thought about my husband, about how we had built this life piece by piece, how many times we had chosen to keep something simply because it mattered to us. Those choices are easy to erode when you are not the one who made them. The phone rang just after 8. The caller ID showed Brian's number, but when I picked up, it was Sloane's voice. She asked if I had given any more thought to making the house safer, perhaps even looking at a few smaller places in town. Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was no mistaking the persistence. I told her I was fine and ended the call before she could press further. I wrote the time and her words in the notebook before I went upstairs. In bed, I could hear the waves pushing against the seawall, steady and certain in their return. I knew the rumors would keep circulating. I knew the visits and calls would continue. But I also knew something else now. Silence had always been my way of keeping peace, smoothing the surface before anyone could see the ripples underneath. The trouble is, once people start mistaking that silence for weakness, they stop respecting the water entirely. I turned out the light and let the darkness settle around me. Tomorrow, I would drive into Providence and sit across from Leighton in his office, and we would talk about locks and deeds and the way to hold on to what is yours without letting the whole world know you are holding it. For now, I would rest, because the work ahead would require patience. And patience I have always had in abundance. The drive into Providence was quiet, except for the hum of the tires on the highway and the occasional hiss of wind against the side mirrors. I had been to Leighton's office countless times over the years, most of them routine visits to update a trust document or review a property tax statement. Today felt different. I carried my kitchen notebook in my handbag, the one that now held more than grocery lists and rose pruning notes. Each line in it was a marker, a record of things I could not afford to forget. Leighton's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building that had once been a bank. The brass handles on the front doors were polished to a shine, the kind of shine that comes from someone taking pride in small details. His receptionist, a woman with quick eyes and a warm voice, offered me coffee while I waited. I declined, preferring to keep my hands steady. When Leighton stepped into the reception area, he greeted me the same way he always had, with a firm handshake and a slight tilt of his head, as though acknowledging something unsaid. We settled into his office, the windows framing a view of the river where a few fishing boats were tied up for the day. He asked what had prompted my call, and I told him plainly, I wanted to review the deed for my home and ensure the trust documents were in order. His brow tightened just slightly, enough for me to see that he was already thinking several steps ahead. He opened a drawer, withdrew a thick file stamped with my name, and set it on the desk between us. We went through the papers together. The trust was still active, the property still securely titled under the irrevocable trust we had established years ago. But then he pulled out a separate folder. This one held copies of documents that had been sent to the county recorder's office, documents I had never seen before. My name was on them in black ink, in a signature that looked almost exactly like mine, but not quite. There was a quitclaim deed, transferring the house from the trust to my son and daughter-in-law jointly, and a power of attorney authorizing them to make all decisions on my behalf. Both bore dates from less than 2 weeks ago. Leighton slid the papers toward me. I studied the signature, my eyes tracing the curves of letters that I knew were not my own hand. The loops were too wide, the pressure too uneven. Whoever had done it had studied my handwriting carefully, but not carefully enough. I kept my voice even as I said that these were not my documents and that I had not signed them. Leighton nodded, then took out a legal pad and began making notes. He said the filings had been flagged by an internal review clerk who recognized the trust name and thought it odd that the property was being transferred out without his involvement. He explained that the filings had not yet been processed to completion because of that flag. That gave us time, but not much. I asked how something like this could happen, and he said that with the right information, someone could attempt it. All they needed was access to my personal details, an old copy of my signature, and enough nerve to walk the paperwork into the recorder's office. The nerve part, I thought, was in no short supply with certain people. Leighton suggested we quietly secure additional protections on the trust and alert the recorder's office that any future filings would require in-person verification from me and from him. He also recommended we consider a private handwriting analysis, not for the sake of proving guilt in court yet, but to build a record in case the situation escalated. I agreed to both. I had no interest in broadcasting what we knew until the time was right. Before I left, he handed me a sealed envelope containing certified copies of the current trust documents and the deed. He told me to keep them in a safe place, somewhere not obvious. I slipped them into my handbag next to the notebook. The weight of the papers was more than physical. It felt like holding the history of my home in my hands. On the drive back to Newport, I replayed the meeting in my mind. The precision of the forged signature, the timing of the filings, the quiet way rumors about my stability had been seeded in the community. It all fit together. This was not an impulse. It was a plan, deliberate and methodical. The thought should have made me angry, but instead, it left me with a sharper sense of purpose. I had proof now. Something tangible beyond whispers and shifted furniture drawers. When I reached home, the sun was low over the water, turning the waves a deep copper. I carried the envelope upstairs to my bedroom and slid it into a box I keep under the bed, the one with family photographs and letters my husband wrote during our first years together. It was not the most secure location, but it was one only I ever opened. Later, as I sat in the library with a cup of tea, I opened the notebook and wrote the day's events in clear, deliberate script. I noted the time of the meeting, the content of the forged documents, and the steps Leighton and I had agreed to take. I added a small mark in the corner of the page, a habit I have when I know a note may be important later. Outside, the tide had turned again, the water drawing back from the rocks before gathering itself for the next push forward. I closed the notebook and set it beside me on the arm of the chair. There is power in patience, but patience works best when paired with preparation. I would let this plan play out, but not without my own moves in place. The difference now was that I had something they did not expect me to have. A clear view of the game before it reached the final round. I have always believed that a well-kept house tells its own story. Every drawer, every shelf, every folder in its place means that when something shifts, even by an inch, you notice. In the days after my meeting with Leighton, I began moving through my home with the deliberate pace of someone taking inventory. Not the kind of inventory you keep on paper for taxes or insurance, but the quiet mental record that comes from living with objects long enough to know their exact weight and where the light falls on them at a certain hour. Each morning started the same. I would walk through the kitchen, check the locks on the doors, then move to the library, the study, the upstairs hallway. I tightened hinges, tested window latches, dusted around frames, and in the process confirmed what was as it should be and what was not. The kitchen notebook came with me everywhere now, its lined pages filling quickly with dates, times, and observations. One page was devoted entirely to the position of my desk drawers, another to the contents of the small safe in the closet where I kept a few heirloom pieces of jewelry and some financial papers. May stopped by one afternoon with a bag of lemons from her tree. We sat in the sunroom, the glass warming us despite the chill outside. I told her, without going into the full detail of Leighton's findings, that I was keeping a closer eye on things. She listened without interruption, only nodding once when I mentioned the desk drawers. Then she offered to be my second set of eyes in town. If Sloane or anyone connected to her began asking questions in places they did not belong, May would hear of it. In a small community like ours, news moves faster through the people who are never in the headlines. That night, after dinner, I began the task of reorganizing the upstairs storage room. Most of it was the usual mix of seasonal decorations, old linens, and boxes of books. But in the far corner, I kept a locked cabinet. Inside were file folders from the years I ran the stores, along with personal records. I pulled everything out, checked for signs of tampering, then repacked it with the most current and sensitive documents buried at the bottom. The key went into a small tin I placed in the back of a kitchen drawer under a layer of dish towels. The following morning, I noticed the back door again. This time it was not just the latch. There was the faintest mark on the paint near the frame, the kind that could come from a tool slipping while trying to fit it into a lock. I took a photograph, printed it, and added it to the folder I had begun in my desk. On a separate page in the notebook, I recorded the date, time, and a note that the mark had not been there the day before. By midweek, I had installed a small motion-activated light above the back entrance. I told no one about it, not even May. The plan was simple. If someone came that way again, I would know. That evening, while sorting through old receipts in the library, I heard the faint click of the front gate. When I glanced through the curtains, I saw a woman in a dark coat walking past slowly, pausing for a moment at the edge of the drive before continuing on. It could have been nothing, but in times like this, you learn that what looks like nothing often isn't. I began making copies of certain documents, not because I feared losing the originals, but because having duplicates stored in more than one place was another layer of defense. Some went into a safe deposit box at the bank in town. Others I entrusted to Leighton's office. The act of creating those copies felt oddly calming, as if each one was a stone laid in a wall no one else could see but me. The routine, as precise as it was, did more than protect the house. It steadied my mind. There is a temptation, when you know someone is working against you, to become reactive, to meet every move with an immediate counter. But experience has taught me that not every action needs to be visible. Sometimes the most effective work is the kind done in quiet, when no one is watching. When you can shape the field to your advantage without your opponent even realizing it has shifted beneath their feet. Late on Thursday, as I was putting away groceries, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was a young woman introducing herself as a home aide. She said she had been told I was in need of part-time help, that she could start as early as the next day. I asked Etal how he had gotten my number, and she said she had been given it by Sloane. I kept my tone neutral and told her I did not require any assistance. After the call ended, I added another line to the notebook and underlined Sloane's name twice. By the week's end, I had a system in place, documents secured in multiple locations, physical evidence of tampering cataloged and dated, a trusted friend positioned to observe the community channels where rumors travel, and above all, a growing awareness of how methodical this intrusion was becoming. It was no longer a matter of whether Sloane would try again, but when, and in what form. As I closed the notebook one evening and placed it beside the lamp on my nightstand, I realized that what had once been my private sanctuary was now an active front in a conflict I had not chosen but would not walk away from. The difference now was that I was ready to meet it, not with raised voice or open confrontation, but with a record so precise it could not be undone. The house was still mine, the air inside it still mine, and as long as that was true, every corner of it would bear my order and my watchfulness. The wind came in sharp off the water that evening, rattling the old shutters and carrying with it the smell of seaweed and rain. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes when I heard the soft creak of the back porch boards. It could have been the wind, but the rhythm was wrong. I set the dish towel on the counter and moved quietly toward the hallway that led to the rear of the house. The motion light I had installed over the back door flicked on, flooding the porch in a cold, white glow. For an instant, I saw the edge of a dark sleeve disappear beyond the frame. My heart gave a hard, steady thud, but my hands were calm. I kept my place inside, counting the seconds until I heard the faint metallic clink of the gate latch, followed by the muffled sound of footsteps moving away across the gravel. I did not open the door. Instead, I walked to the desk in the library, retrieved my camera, and stepped just far enough onto the porch to photograph the fresh footprints on the mat. The porch board still held the warmth of the light, and the air smelled faintly of cologne that did not belong to anyone who lived here. I took another picture of the faint smudge on the doorframe, near the lock, then closed the door and turned the deadbolt. By the time Officer Ramirez arrived, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the drive. He listened as I explained what had happened, his eyes narrowing slightly when I showed him the photographs. He knelt to inspect the doorframe, confirming that there were new marks, shallow but telling. He did not speculate on who might have been there, only said that whoever it was had some experience with locks. I told him I wanted this documented, and he nodded, writing it into his report. After he left, the house seemed quieter than usual, as if it too was listening. I walked through each room, checking the windows and doors again. Everything was secure, but the air felt different, heavier in a way that made my shoulders tighten. I sat in the kitchen with the notebook open, writing down the time the light had come on, the direction the figure had moved, the scent in the air, the sound of the latch. These were the details that would matter later. Not long after, the phone rang. The number was familiar this time. Sloane's. Her voice came warm, almost relieved, as she said she had been thinking about our last conversation. She told me she wanted to smooth things over, that she had acted out of concern, and that perhaps we could meet the next day to discuss options for making the house safer. The words were soft, but they pressed in all the same. I told her I would think about it and ended the call before she could go further. I sat for a long time after that, the phone resting on the table beside the notebook. The timing was too neat. A shadow on the porch 1 hour, a call offering reconciliation the next. It was not an accident. It was a test. I thought about the photographs, the report Officer Ramirez had filed, and the growing stack of notes in my book. I was no longer just responding to her moves. I was collecting the pieces that would form the picture she had hoped to keep hidden. By midnight, the wind had eased. I walked to the window in the library and looked out toward the back gate, now closed and still under the beam of the motion light. The garden beyond swayed gently, the roses bending under the damp air. The house stood steady around me, each lock turned, each curtain drawn. I knew they would try again, and when they did, I would be ready to meet them with more than words. The next morning broke with a pale sky and a thin layer of frost on the lawn. I moved slowly through my routine, the night before still sitting in my chest like a weight. The photographs from the porch lay on the kitchen counter, alongside the police report Officer Ramirez had left me. I slid both into the growing folder in my desk, locking it before I poured my coffee. By mid-morning, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed the number of the bank in town. Lara, the young woman who managed my account there, spoke in a quiet voice. She said someone had been in asking questions about procedures for using a power of attorney to authorize the sale of property. The person had a copy of a document with my name on it and claimed I had already signed. Lara told me she found it odd, especially since she knew I usually handled everything in person. I thanked her, asked her to keep the conversation between us, and made a note in my kitchen notebook with the time and her exact words. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long while, letting the pieces arrange themselves in my mind. The late-night visitor, the sudden offer from Sloan to meet, and now this inquiry at the bank. It was not just persistence anymore. It was acceleration. She was pushing toward something, and she believed the ground had been cleared for her. That afternoon, May stopped by with a bag of fresh rolls from the bakery. We sat in the sunroom, the winter light spilling over the glass table between us. I told her about Lara's call, about the copy of the document, and the questions at the bank. May's eyes sharpened in that way they do when she is fitting a puzzle together. She reminded me to keep my calm and let the rope play out, the same way her father had taught her to fish. Sometimes, she said, you have to let the line run until the catch takes itself. Later, I called Leighton and told him what Lara had said. He asked me to come by his office the next morning and to bring both my notebook and any copies of documents I had. His voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of focus. He told me we were at the point where timing mattered. As dusk came in, I pulled on my coat and walked the perimeter of the property. The roses were bare now, their canes dark against the pale soil. The air smelled faintly of the sea, and the cold made each breath feel sharper. I paused at the back gate, running my fingers over the latch. The motion light above the porch clicked on behind me, throwing my shadow long across the yard. For a moment, I imagined another set of steps on the path, just out of view, but there was nothing except the wind moving through the hedges. Inside, I set water to boil for tea and opened the desk to review my notes. There was a certain satisfaction in seeing the record take shape, dates, names, events, each one tied to something tangible. I added Lara's call and underlined it twice. I knew now that whatever meeting Sloan wanted, it would not be for reconciliation. It would be for positioning, for making her next step seem inevitable. The phone stayed silent for the rest of the night. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes before a change in the weather. I sat in the library with my tea, watching the lamplight pool across the rug, and felt the quiet stretch out like a held breath. In the morning, I would go to Leighton with what I had. The more she pressed, the more she revealed, and when the moment came, I intended to have every detail in place. Leighton's office was warm and smelled faintly of cedar when I stepped in the next morning. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain. He was already at his desk, a stack of files open in front of him, his reading glasses low on his nose. He gestured for me to sit, then closed the door. I handed him my notebook and the copies of every document I had, including the unsigned power of attorney that Sloan must have tried to mimic. He flipped through each page with a steady hand, occasionally jotting something on a legal pad. His eyes narrowed at Lara's note about the bank visit. He explained that forging or altering such a document was not just unethical, but criminal, and that we now had grounds to involve the district attorney if needed. We went over my timeline, matching each incident with the evidence I had collected. He nodded slowly, as if weighing the shape of the situation. Then he told me he had arranged a discreet meeting with a contact at the DA's office. For now, he advised, I should continue to keep my interactions with Sloane polite but limited, giving her no reason to suspect the extent of what I knew. By the time I left his office, the rain had started. I drove through town, the wet streets reflecting the glow of the traffic lights, and stopped at the small diner near the waterfront for a late breakfast. The waitress, a woman about my age with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, brought me coffee and a plate of eggs without needing to ask for my order. It was a comfort to be in a place where the routine was unshaken, where people knew you for yourself, not for what they thought they could take from you. When I got home, the answering machine light was blinking, 39 calls, all from Sloane's number. I listened to none of them, letting the count speak for itself. The mansion's title, still in my name, had clearly reached her ears. Whatever patience she had was dissolving, replaced by a frantic energy that made her reckless. In the afternoon, I went to the library to retrieve a box of old records stored in the bottom cabinet. Inside were letters from my late husband's attorney, property deeds, and photographs from the years when the house was still filled with the noise of family gatherings. I took out the most relevant papers and placed them in a separate folder, the one I intended to bring to Leighton's contact. That evening, as the rain tapped against the windows, I sat by the fire and reviewed my notes again. The pattern was clear now. Sloane had moved from charm to pressure, then to manipulation, and finally to outright forgery. It was a steady climb toward a single goal. The difference now was that I was no longer moving blindly through her path. Every step she took left a mark I could trace. I closed the folder and set it on the table beside me. The storm outside was building, but inside, there was a sense of readiness settling over me. Whatever she tried next, I would not be caught unprepared. This was no longer about enduring her presence. It was about making sure she understood that my silence had been a choice, and that choice was about to end. 2 days after the rainstorm, Leighton called to tell me the meeting with the district attorney's contact was set. It would take place at a quiet office on the east side of town, far from the courthouse and any prying eyes. He reminded me to bring every piece of original documentation I had, along with the copies, and to be prepared to recount the sequence of events without embellishment. I spent that afternoon arranging my folder until it looked like the evidence binder from a courtroom drama, each page marked and in perfect order. The next morning, I dressed with deliberate care. A simple navy suit, low heels, and my late husband's watch, polished until the silver gleamed. It was not vanity. It was armor, the kind of quiet statement that said I was neither frail nor to be dismissed. The office was tucked into a converted brick warehouse, the kind of place most people would pass without notice. Inside, a narrow hallway led to a conference room where a woman in her 50s sat waiting. Her handshake was firm, her eyes steady, and she listened without interrupting as Leighton introduced me and outlined the case. I began with the earliest incident, the gradual shifts in Sloane's behavior, the manipulations disguised as concern, and finally, the forged document. Each time I laid a piece of evidence on the table, the woman made a note on a yellow legal pad. She asked about dates, names, and whether any third parties had witnessed key events. I gave her Laura's account, the bank clerk's change in demeanor, and even the small details, like the sudden disappearance of my original deed from the home office file cabinet. When I finished, there was a silence in the room, the kind that hangs heavy before a verdict. She closed her pad and told me the DA's office would begin preliminary steps quietly. It was important, she said. not to give Sloane any reason to suspect she was under investigation until they were ready to act. That meant I needed to continue my routine, as though nothing had changed. The drive home felt longer than usual. My thoughts kept circling back to the image of Sloane pacing her kitchen, phone in hand, making call after call that I would never return. Her world was beginning to shift beneath her feet, though she had no idea how far it might crumble. That evening, I decided to hold my weekly bridge game with two neighbors as usual. It was a way to keep the pattern unbroken, to let the hum of ordinary life mask the quiet machinery now moving against her. As we played, the conversation turned to small-town news, the new cafe opening on Main Street, the rising price of groceries. I smiled and played my hand as if my thoughts weren't elsewhere, as if I wasn't mentally mapping each step until the moment Sloane's bravado would finally collapse. Later, after the house was quiet, I poured a single glass of wine and sat in the den with the fire burning low. The folder of evidence lay on the table, the edges neatly aligned. I thought of the years I had spent building this life, the care I had taken to preserve the home and the legacy that came with it. For too long, I had let someone else treat that care as weakness. Now, each page in that folder felt like a stone in the foundation of something stronger. Outside, the wind began to rise again, rattling the shutters, a sign that another storm was on its way. I did not mind. Some storms, I had learned, were worth facing head-on. The first sign that something had shifted came late on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie, when my neighbor, Edna, called to say she had seen a county vehicle parked outside Sloane's boutique earlier that day. Edna had no reason to connect the dots, but I knew exactly what it meant. The district attorney's office was beginning to make quiet moves. I went about my evening as though nothing was out of place. The pie went into the oven, the laundry into the dryer, the porch light flicked on just after dusk. Yet beneath that rhythm, a low hum of anticipation ran through me. It was the first tangible ripple from the work we had put in, and I could almost feel it spreading outward. The next morning, Leighton called. His tone was calm but deliberate. He said an official request for certain financial records had been made through discreet channels, and that it would eventually reach Sloane's notice. The goal was to let her wonder, to let the uncertainty gnaw at her before she had anything concrete to react to. I understood the strategy. A mind like hers, one built on control, would start to unravel long before the real consequences arrived. By Saturday, I noticed subtle changes. The usual string of missed calls had slowed, replaced by the occasional text from an unknown number, likely her trying to get through without using her own line. I did not reply. Instead, I kept my phone face down on the side table, its silence more satisfying than any conversation could have been. That evening, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the last of the autumn leaves skittering along the pavement. I passed the Hendersons' house and saw their grandchildren chasing each other on the lawn, their laughter ringing out against the early night. It struck me how different my own family's story had become, how far it had drifted from the simple warmth that used to fill my home. The thought did not bring sadness so much as resolve. On Sunday, Lara stopped by. She was quieter than usual, setting her bag down and offering to make tea without much small talk. When she finally sat across from me, she admitted she had heard from a friend that Sloane was acting unusually distracted at work, even curt with her regular customers. Lara didn't ask for details. She had learned not to, but I saw the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. I simply told her that some truths had a way of rising to the surface no matter how deeply they were buried. That night, I pulled the old family photo albums from the bookshelf. Not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder, page after page of birthdays, Sunday dinners, vacations by the lake. They were a record of the years before resentment and greed began to cloud the edges. Looking at them, I felt a strange mixture of loss and clarity. Those moments were gone, but they had shaped the woman sitting here now, steady and unwilling to be moved. By Monday morning, another call from Leighton confirmed the momentum was building. More records had been flagged for review, and discreet interviews were being planned with individuals connected to the property's transfer. He advised me to keep my schedule predictable, to avoid any sudden changes that might make Sloan suspicious. I spent the rest of the day in my garden, clearing out the last of the summer beds, the scent of damp earth rising as I worked. Each root I pulled, each wilted stalk I cut away, felt like a quiet echo of the process already underway in the shadows, removing what was no longer healthy, making room for something stronger to grow. The sun dipped low, casting long gold light across the yard. I stood there for a moment, hands still, knowing the fracture had begun. It was only a matter of time before the cracks widened enough for everything she had built on deceit to come tumbling down. The call came just after sunrise. Leighton's voice was calm, almost satisfied. The investigation had concluded, and the findings were clear. Every hidden transfer, every falsified document, every signature forged in haste was now laid bare in official language. The mansion, the land, the investments, all confirmed as mine. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in my hands, letting the weight of those words settle over me. Months of restraint, of biting back the urge to lash out, had led to this moment. It was not loud or triumphant, but it was final. By late afternoon, I heard from Laura again. She had passed Sloan in town and said she looked pale, almost brittle. I imagined the walls closing in on her, the frantic way she must have been dialing my number 39 times, each call a little more desperate than the last. I had not answered then, and I would not answer now. Instead, I walked the halls of the mansion, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching on the framed photographs and polished wood. This house had been my burden and my shelter, my prison and my shield. Now it was simply mine again, without question, without shadow. As evening fell, I sat by the fireplace, the crackle of the logs the only sound. There was no sense of revenge burning hot in my chest, only the steady, cool knowledge that dignity reclaimed was more valuable than anything stolen. I had not shouted, I had not begged. I had waited, and the truth had done the rest. In that stillness, I knew this was the closing of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. My voice, once buried under years of silence, had returned, not in volume, but in certainty, and I would never lose it again. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching. Sometimes, it is not the loudest battles that win, but the quiet endurance that holds through the storm. If this story reminded you of a time when you had to stand firm and wait for the truth to surface, you are not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments so others can find strength in your words. And remember, your silence is not weakness. It can be the most powerful answer of all.